about the background to this project, which has been a transformational project in the North East. I'm going to go into a bit of detail about the split of the works and how it's been delivered between essentially the upgrade of the railway and then the construction of new stations, highways and structures around the railway. And then I'm going to talk about some lessons learned, probably about 40-45 minutes if I get my timing right, and then there'll be some time for some Q&A afterwards. So it's really important to know that this project is a railway project, but it's a project that's very much about social and economic regeneration for a region in the North East that was hit quite hard as industry, particularly around the mining industry, sort of declined. You may be aware that there was actually an existing railway that was closed to passenger services in the 60s, and since then has been running as a freight railway, predominantly to transport wooden pellets up to the Linemouth power station up past Ashington. So the challenge for the project was essentially to reintroduce passenger services to that railway. The driver for that is really moving people off the roads onto the railway and to give people from South East Northumberland access to jobs and education in Newcastle. To do that, the journey time from Ashington to Newcastle needs to be quick enough to get people off the buses and out of the cars. So the journey time of 35 minutes is about half the time it takes to get into Newcastle from Ashington at the moment. It's also really important that when introducing the passenger service as well, that the freight operational requirements are maintained for the railway. And the modelling that we developed showed that a 2 train per hour service would be the sort of the right level of service to provide the necessary demands to suit the business case. You can see the bottom bullet there about the competitive ticket pricing. The pricing is very competitive, so it's £2.60 for a single ticket from Ashington into Newcastle, which obviously is really, really important for the local people there. And you can see dotted along the line there are 6 stations serving the communities along the line from Ashington down to Newcastle. I'll go into a bit more detail about those, but it's worth highlighting that the last station that's flagged there, Northumberland Park. So this is where the Northumberland Line actually there's a station right next to what is the Tyne and Wear metro station at Northumberland Park. So not only does it give you access into Newcastle, it also gives you access to the wider Tyne and Wear metro system. So I probably touched on this in the first slide, so I probably won't linger on it. But the key thing here is that there's a real balance of getting the operational timetable requirements right and balancing that with the infrastructure. A lot of the track that was there was single track. So for the best sort of operational performance, you twin track the entire railway from the East Coast Main Line up to Ashington, but there would be a cost associated with that. So I'll show you a diagram in a bit that talks about how we got the balance just right in terms of the infrastructure required to allow the freight services to run, but also the new passenger services. This is quite a busy slide, but this is basically almost my history in time on the project. So I started working on it in 2018 when it was really an idea and it was an aspiration for the region to reintroduce services on what was known then as the Ashington, Blythe and Tyne line. And I was saying to Howard earlier, for 20 years, there's a local campaign group that had really been pushing for this passenger service to be reintroduced. But for various reasons, the industry hadn't really sort of had the appetite to move the project forward. So we had a small commission from Northumberland County Council to re-look at the potential demand and the potential costs of building that railway. And actually that washed his face and actually sort of presented quite a compelling case for the railway. There's a lot of sort of industry stage gates that you can see in the diamonds on the screen and those sort of things. I won't go into the detail of those, but essentially every project needs to go from being an idea through various iterations of the business case that firm up the plan. As you develop the designs, you understand the cost of it more, you understand some of the constraints around when you've undertaken surveys and ground investigations, the type of work that's required. So those diamonds along the top are essentially the gates you need to get through to essentially convince central government and the Treasury that it's worth the investment and that you've got a robust plan for delivering the project. And by the end of 2019, we moved on to the next step, and we had quite a good case for the railway. But then we were hit by COVID, and doing surveys and ground investigations became a bit of a challenge. But one of the benefits of COVID was also that it tried to promote in the industry a new way of working. There was this concept of something called Project Speed that was based on the idea around the Nightingale hospitals, that if you really needed to do something, you could get it done. And there was loads of ambition that was built around Project Speed. And this project became a flag bearer for Project Speed for the industry, which meant it had loads of political interest and support, but it also meant that the expectations of when it would be delivered were incredibly high. So the targets that were initially set were for the railway to open in December 23. That didn't become a reality for reasons that I'll touch on, but it certainly helped inject some pace and some funding into the project. In headline terms, so since 2018 through to 2024, we've essentially designed and started to deliver the project. So there's some colleagues from Morgan Sindall in the room who've been involved in the construction of the stations. The first 2 stations were constructed and with that completion in the summer of 2024. Then Northern Trains, the operator, started driver training, and the first 2 stations opened successfully in December 2024. We've opened 2 more stations throughout this year, and then the final 2 stations, which are Bedlington and Northumberland Park, will open early next year and will be up at full operation. This is the delivery model, which is quite novel. Normally, when a project like this is delivered, it's delivered by Network Rail. But in this case, we were challenged and took the opportunity around do something very different and put the local authority at the heart of the project. So Northumberland County Council essentially have owned and sponsored the project. They've put funding into the scheme as well, so it's not all central government funding, and that's meant that they've been able to really connect the local needs with the outputs of the project. So for example, thinking about the requirements for where the stations were placed and the access to the station as part of the sort of local active travel and sort of cycle route networks and those sorts of things. It's really important to note as well that in the sort of the threads of the work, so essentially you've got on the left hand column, Northumberland County Council employed AECOM, who I work for, to integrate all of the different aspects of it. The second column to the left is Network Rail, essentially delivering the rail corridor upgrades, so the track, the signalling, the level crossing upgrades and those sorts of things. Then Northumberland County Council with Morgan Sindall delivered the stations, the associated highways upgrades and some structures around the railway. But really importantly as well, you cannot forget that Northern Trains were part of this team, and as the operator and ultimately the people who will be responsible for the stations and those sorts of things, they were in the team as well. So this is the before and after. So as I touched on, a large proportion of the line single track. So to the left, you've got Benton Junction, which is the junction with the East Coast Main Line that takes you down to Newcastle. And then you can see on the bottom section of the diagram where we've introduced new infrastructure. So on the left-hand side, for example, you can see Palmersville Dairy. So this is a new underpass beneath the railway. And then you've got the 6 stations. You've got sections of new twin track railway, so this Seg Hill Loop and the extension of the twin track section at Newsham, and then you've got various structures over the railway. Another big aspect of this as well is around the level crossings. So if you think that before we did this work, essentially there were two or three freight trains per day trundling up and down the railway and at low speed. The behaviours around the railway were fairly sort of laxed. In fact, some people would walk their dogs along the railway based on the fact that they didn't think there was a train, they'd hear it coming and those sorts of things. So we're now in a world of 2 trains per hour in each direction, faster trains as well. So the risks around the level crossings and where the general public can access the railway and the interface with pedestrian crossings and highways crossings are quite high. So upgrading all of those level crossings is a big part of the scope of works as well. So this is Northern's role on the project. So essentially, this is a hot topic at the moment. They've got 4 158 trains that are operating on the railway. This is not new rolling stock, it's rolling stock that was cascaded, I think, from the East Midlands route. We'll come on to it, but essentially they're running 2-car trains, and already in the peak these are getting really full. So there's a challenge for Northern there in terms of increasing the rolling stock, and that isn't an easy thing for Northern to fix. They can't just magic additional units out of thin air. So that's a challenge. But they've also been responsible for all of the driver training. And when I talk about the conductors, that puts a grin on my face, because last time I went up there, I was talking to a conductor called Ashley who lives in Blythe. He was really just buzzing about the fact that he's now got a job working on this railway that's sort of 2 minutes from his house. He can cycle to his place of work, and there's this real local ownership around the project, which is fantastic. And they're also responsible for the station facilities. And you can see in the bottom left corner the stat there that, having opened in December last year, we've now exceeded 800,000 journeys, and that's with 2 stations, then 1 + 1 opening. So the numbers are ahead of the sort of business case demand forecasts. There's some messages in the press that it's 5 times the demand model. That isn't the case. The ramp up in the sort of passenger usage is about 29% above what the sort of the DFT models would normally suggest, but it's really encouraging that the uptake has been so fantastic. So I'll go through the different aspects of essentially what's being delivered to essentially facilitate that service running. So you can see Network Rail and their supply chain have delivered track renewals on the majority of the track. A lot of it was pre-1976 rail, so had to be replaced. All of the signalling along the route was essentially mechanical signalling, so that's been replaced by what's known as modular computer-based interlocking systems. This isn't my sort of area of expertise, but essentially this is modern signalling technology. And as I've touched on, there's 24 different types of crossing where either foot crossings or road crossings cross the railway. So those 24 have all been upgraded in different ways, but with some being closed outright. So that saves money in the fact that you don't need to introduce the infrastructure, but it creates a challenge that you have to go through a planning process to get those closed. And also Network Rail and their supply chain were responsible for the construction and strengthening of 3 structures beneath the track. We live in a pretty constrained environment in terms of budget, and linked as well to project speed. There was a real challenge on this project to make sure that everything that we wanted to deliver was justifiable, and it was the lowest cost solution to give the sort of the solution that was required. So there's this phrase that's used in the railway industry called minimum viable product. So essentially that is the sort of the lowest cost solution to delivering the output that you need. And we applied this actually before it was a thing, before Project Speed. We were already working on behalf of the local authority and the council to make sure this was the most cost-effective scheme possible. That meant that when we're looking at the level crossing upgrades, there is an option to improve with modern technology all of the level crossings, but we went through a sort of a filtering process to make sure that the costs weren't disproportionate versus the risk for those level crossings. And as I say, we closed a few. I've also highlighted their Newsham level crossing. So this is a level crossing where the A1061, which is the main road into the Port of Blythe, crosses the railway. And in the morning peaks, just with the freight services, there were always challenges around the level crossing barrier downtime at this crossing, and the traffic would back up into the port. So the local authority were very keen that this crossing was replaced. So a key element of the scope that Morgan Sindall have delivered is a road over the railway at that point, and that level crossing is being closed. What that means, though, is that you've got Morgan Sindall delivering the highway bridge, and you've got Network Rail and their supply chain delivering the level crossing and the signalling upgrade. And from a programme perspective, you've got to make sure that that works perfectly, because you can't close the crossing until the bridge is in place. So part of the challenge for the combined project team was making sure that the programme worked for that to happen. So as well as replacing essentially the old track and the old rails, there were quite a lot of junction improvements required to basically bring them up to modern standards for the line speeds that were required. This work was delivered predominantly throughout 2022 and 2023. So essentially the railway element of this project was delivered first. Some of it on the basis of what they call no regrets, because the track was so old it needed replacing anyway. So Network Rail and their supply chain started that before the project was actually fully funded, but on the basis that it would be money well spent. As I've touched on, they've replaced 3 underbridges. These are predominantly in the areas where the track needed to be widened. And you can see here, this is the section south of Newsham where we needed a twin track section on the embankments there. The embankment in theory was wide enough to accommodate the twin track section, but if you looked at the alignment as it was before we started, it sort of weaved along the embankment, because over time various sort of maintenance teams had just shuffled the track into the middle as the sort of embankment was eroding or becoming a bit of a rabbit warren. So that was an important aspect to upgrade that section of earthworks. And we've touched on this is Bedlington Station, which is flanked at either end by level crossings, and there's also this track junction and signal box in the middle. So this is quite a constrained site, but here it was really important that Network Rail delivered the railway upgrade elements, and they were out of the way of the level crossings before Morgan Sindall could come along and deliver the stations. Also points out here, I mean, this is a constrained site. On the left-hand side of the left-hand picture, that's Sleekburn House, which is a residential home. So we're working in a very constrained urban environment, drilling holes, constructing literally outside people's windows. So the public interface and dealing with the stakeholder management and the communications of who was going to do what when was a really important aspect of this. So we'll go on to the stations and the structures. So this is the element that's been delivered essentially by Northumberland County Council and Morgan Sindall. 6 stations, 4 are now open, 5 of them with car parks. So the car parks are of differing scale and linked to what I was saying about this idea of minimum viable product and funding constraints. One of the challenges we had with the project, as the cost started to go up, we were challenged by the DFT to take costs out of the project, and one area where that could be done was reducing the car park size. So we've got the land for bigger car parks, but at the moment we've only constructed, say at Seaton, half the scale of the car park that was initially planned. At the moment those car parks are absolutely chock-a-block, which is a challenge, but we don't know if that will be the case when all of the stations have opened. So I'm pretty confident that in the future years there'll be work to expand those car parks using the land that we've got. And I'll go on to some of the other elements of the underpass and the bridges as well, because I've got some specific slides on those. So this is the southern end. So this is Palmersville Dairy. So you can see what was there before. There's just this pedestrian foot crossing across the railway. Initially, this was going to be replaced by a bridge, but this element of the project went through local planning with North Tyneside Council, and it was really important from a planning perspective that the solution fitted in terms of the local cycle network, and also provided access for horse riders and equestrian use as well, I believe. So The result of that was that we actually had to put this underpass in beneath the railway, which is a pretty significant piece of infrastructure. This was one of the first pieces of work that Morgan Sindall completed, and you can see essentially in the summer of 2023, I think the conditions were okay in terms of the weather, but essentially the railway was severed. So Network Rail supply chain came along and essentially cut the rail either side of where the structure was going in. Then Morgan Sindall pushed the structure under the railway, and then it was reinstated, and then Network Rail suppliers, which was Balfour Beatty, put the track back on top. So that was one of the first sort of significant milestones in terms of delivery of the stations and structures work. These were the first two stations to open. So these are the ones that opened in December 2024. So Ashington at the top, you can see in the photos there that there was a station here historically, just on the edge of the town centre in Ashington. When we first started the project, particularly some politicians thought, well, we'll just reuse the platform, but it wasn't that straightforward, because to create the up and down passenger service and allow freight to carry on running up to Linemouth Power Station, you can see in the top right picture, we've actually had to move the platform to the left on that picture and introduce essentially what's a turn back facility. So the trains run up to the platform there, they stop at the end of the railway, and then they come back down. So the car park there was also significantly extended. So there was a car park here for the residents of Ashington, but that's been extended quite dramatically. And in the bottom left of that picture, you can just see essentially the porter cabin there. That's the conductor facility for the Northern train crew. Next station down, similar in construction in that it's a single platform station on a single line section of the track. This is at Seaton. So you can see before the station was there, this was essentially just a field. So this is a clean slate. You can see in the bottom right picture, you've got the train there pulling in the platform, and the car parks skewed away from the station. And this is an example of where the scale of the car park was reduced. So the land to the right of the car park there is still essentially owned now by Northumberland County Council, the project for future expansion. So then we'll go to Blythe Bebbside. So the two stations we opened this year are both either side of Blythe town. So Bebbside was the one that opened in September this year, and this is to the north of the town. To access the station, essentially you've got the A189, which is one of the main spine roads into Newcastle. We've constructed this new cycle bridge, so this provides good pedestrian and cycle access to the station. You can also see in the bottom right picture the car park there. So there's good access here off the A189, and essentially this can operate as a park and ride. So people from further north can come down the 189, pull off here and get on the train, and it's only 20 minutes into Newcastle from Bebbside. Then Newsham, so this is the one that's south of Blythe. So in the top left picture, you can see what was there originally. So just to the sort of the top of that roundabout, that's the level crossing over the railway. And that's what we saw in 2021 as we started the ground investigations, essentially some pretty wet and soggy fields. So in terms of the project progressing, as I touched on, the key element of this was getting that bridge in. And there was a key date in November 2023 when essentially this crane was on site ready to lift the bridge deck in. That was a key moment. Sorry, just gonna have to excuse me, my battery's going to die. Right, panic over. We've got power. And then you can see in the bottom left, essentially, I put this in because I think it's a brilliant example of what you do in design and essentially the digital model you create, which is the bottom left, how that then becomes reality. And you can see essentially the bridge going over the railway there, and you've got the station essentially underneath the bridge, and now that level crossing is closed, but you've got access to the car parks on either side. I've put this next slide in just to sort of compare and contrast the two. So left is Newsham with the bridge going over the railway, and the right is Bebbside, but you can see essentially the core elements of the station are almost identical in terms of the lift, the bridge, the stairs, the platform construction. So to help with efficiency and delivery and cost, we've tried to, where possible, keep consistency in terms of the design approach, and that then feeds into delivery. So then we've got 2 stations to go. So this is Bedlington. So you can see here the sort of the overview with the level crossing at the south. If you look at the railway on the right, you can see some old station buildings. The lower one closest to the level crossing, that's now been demolished. The second building there, I believe that's going to be repurposed and opened as a bistro, hopefully in the future. So there's an opportunity there for local business. But you can see here essentially what the station will become. So you've got access on the bottom right where that old building has been demolished. You've got 2 new platforms. So as I touched on the left hand side, you've got the platform that's squeezed into that very tight slither of land adjacent to Sleekburn House. And then you've got some fairly simple station furniture on the platform. And then you can see this is the reality as it is essentially today. This is probably from a couple of weeks ago, but this work is very close to completion. So the platforms are in, the platform furniture's there. It's just really that bottom right corner, the access in where that old station building was, that needs to be completed. So this work is broadly due for completion this side of Christmas, but the station won't open until probably late February, March, because when you finish construction, there's quite a lot of industry process you need to go through before you can actually open the station. And then the last station will be here. So this is Northumberland Park as was. So this is the metro station, and I think it's just take a sort of close look at this, because you can see on the left hand side. So there's this heavily vegetated sort of cutting slope, and Northumberland Park station, the metro station, has been sort of squeezed in there. And there's many visits I went on when we sort of looked over the edge of the bridge there and thought, how on earth are we going to squeeze a station into this tight location? But you can see here the design. So essentially this is again a single platform station where access from a lift and stairs comes down from the bridge that goes over the railway, and we squeeze the station in. But as I touched on, this is really important, this site, because this gives access to the Tyne and Wear metro as well. And then in a similar vein, this is as it is now. So essentially the station is very close to completion now. Again, it will be, the main works will be completed this side of Christmas. There's a bit of work to do around tree planting and replacement of that vegetation and trees. You can see here as well, going back to what I was saying about local residents, the flats known as Fenwick Close flats next to the station, they've had to endure 2 years of work essentially in their back garden, and we've credit to Morgan Sindall and the stakeholder management team. The relationship with the residents there is excellent, to the point that I think there's one chap who lives in the flats who runs a daily blog, and he wants to know what's going on every day. And they've put up with a lot, but I think they've put up with it because they know the long-term benefit that it will give them, because they won't need a stopping service into Newcastle now on the metro. They'll just go straight through, and the wider benefits of the Northumberland line. So I'll just touch on some lessons learned. I want to reflect on a few things. I'm not going to go into masses of detail, but key elements of the lessons learned is around the fact that there are a lot of other projects that want to do what Northumberland Line has done. So, for example, down in the southwest, there's the Portishead Line extension, which is a project that, when we started on this, Portishead was actually a stage ahead of us, but they're just about to start construction now. There's there's projects in South Wales, there's a project called West London Orbital, which is a conversion of freight to passenger and new stations in London. And I guess we're here in Rugby, we're not that far away from where East West Rail will be happening as well. And a big element of East West Rail, the Marston Vale section, is a section of upgrade of existing railway and new stations. So there's lots of projects that have similarities, and as I'll go on to describe, this hasn't been straightforward. So it's really important that some of the things that we've been through are not repeated, and these other projects do learn the lessons from it. So the top left box is borrowed from Mark Wilde. So Mark Wilde is now the chief executive of HS2, but before that he was with Crossrail, and he did a presentation in our offices a couple of years back, and I like this this sort of matrix because I thought it's quite a simple way of describing the balance of project ambition versus reality. So if you think about Northumberland Line, before we started in 2018, as I said, this project had been kicking around the industry for a long time, and it was really stuck. There's loads of projects like this in the industry that can't really get out of the sort of starting blocks. So we were really lucky that we managed to sort of pick up the project. It does have a compelling business case. The benefit cost ratio is strong, but with the sort of ambition of the local authority and some commitment from them to put essentially seed funding into the project, we really got it moving forward. So at an early stage through 2019, I think we were sort of in the sort of high performing box. But then, as I touched on briefly at the start with that timeline, we got into the world of sort of over ambition and project speed, where some targets were set that were incredibly challenging, and we felt that we were essentially being used as the guinea pig for every possible new industry process going. So we've had to sort of navigate our way from being in that bottom right box to get back up to high performance. And one of my colleagues, a chap called Neil Blackburn, who's the programme director, who joined in late 2021, a big part of his job has been to navigate getting back up to high performance. And to do that, he's had to work really closely with the DFT and the local authority to put more, or to find funding to put more money into the scheme to make it happen, because the programme targets were very ambitious, but also the cost targets. One of the buzz phrases that was used along project speed was what needs to be true. So there's this idea that if all of these things became true, then you'd be able to achieve this really ambitious date and this really ambitious sort of cost plan. But the reality is that I call this the anti-Swiss cheese model. If one of those slices moves, the house of cards comes down, and the knock-on effect of delays with funding or delays in procurement or not having your planning and consents in place, it means that all of the ambition is sort of slipped. So managing the expectations around that and not falling into the trap of groupthink and everyone being heroic and saying, yes, we'll get this done, is a really important thing. Having said that, the bottom right graphic, so I quite often debate with Neil the balance of this concept of thinking slow and acting fast, so planning and planning and planning to make sure you get things right, versus progress and stagnation. And I think the key thing here is starting things early that you can do on a no regrets basis, or the things that are going to de-risk your project at a later stage, like ground investigation, like diverting utilities, those sorts of things. So it's getting the balance absolutely right. I have worked on some other projects recently where I think they're very much stuck in the planning stage, and they're planning and planning and planning, and all of that takes time, cost, and money. And for projects to happen, they need to be ready when something happens politically and there's some interest, or when some funding becomes available. So we were lucky with Northumberland that we were right place, right time, but some projects are so stuck in planning that they're just not ready when the money comes. And that's really what I'm touching on in the bottom left as well. More general lessons. So I've touched on this concept of minimum viable product. We, I think, did a pretty good job of fixing those requirements and holding on to those requirements throughout the project. When there were challenges with funding, we were asked questions about, well, what will the scheme cost, or how much can we save if we don't deliver Blythe Bebbside? We'll take that station out. That's, for argument's sake, a £30 million element of the cost. We'll take that out and that will save us that money. But you wouldn't have the park and ride facility coming off the A189. You wouldn't have the car parking spaces. You wouldn't have the patronage for the north of Blythe. So the business case and the benefit cost ratio would fall apart with that as well. So we had a really tough battle with the DFT, but Neil did a fantastic job of navigating that and making sure that the full requirements and that core scope have been retained throughout. On the top right, I think for sponsors of projects and owners of projects, it's very easy to fall into a trap of seeing a number, particularly if it's a low number, and clinging on to it and thinking that that's the number that the project will be delivered for. So there's a note of caution around the cost of a project. Don't just look at the point estimate, look at the range and look at the risks associated with it, and be very careful of taking a number, and particularly then using that number in sort of outwardly with sort of key stakeholders who will cling on to that number as well. And that moves on to the bottom left. So stakeholder engagement at every level, from the local neighbours that I've touched on, because these are the people who will be impacted by the works. And when you go through the various planning processes, quite rightly, they have a voice in that. So you need to make sure that they're suitably engaged and they're sort of bought into the project. With that as well, we did a lot of engagement with the freight operator, but also with the end user. So at Linemouth Power Station, when we were doing the majority of the railway upgrade works, and essentially you get to the end of that and you need to commission it, you need to close the railway to do that for a period of time. So we had some really good negotiations with Linemouth to understand how much of wood pellet they could stockpile, how long they could sort of survive for without the sort of the throughput. So that engagement, not only with the freight company but also with the end user, was really important. And as Neil has done, keeping the funders and the politicians on side, that's he's done that with central government politicians right up to the rail minister and the transport secretary, who's had to sort of keep convincing of the value of this project, but also with local politicians as well. So it's I think it's been in the press this year. So the North East Combined Authority have put money into this scheme as well to help it reach its completion. So that's through the sort of the local political input. As I've touched on, starting works early, works in inverted commas, being these sort of enabling activity, can be incredibly beneficial. Now, you need to have the money to do that. So you may need to convince funders that there needs to be some upfront funding that will basically de-risk the later stages of the project. You also need to have the suitable access to the land. So PDR is the permitted development rights that Network Rail have. So using those to get access to the land to undertake those early activities before you've got, say, the Transport Works Act order in place is really important. But that can't be underestimated, the benefits of that. I haven't really touched on it, but for me, we can overcomplicate things in the rail industry, and in many ways we've simplified things on Northumberland. The team of the people who have integrated the project is very small. There's about 15 people in that core team, and because it's a small team, they're close to the detail and they're not relying on levels and levels and levels of reporting. There was an insistence that we needed to have a fully integrated, all singing, all dancing schedule, which is great. This is a management tool that the industry loves, but Neil knew what the top 80 interfaces were and managed that on a table in a spreadsheet because he was close enough to the detail to be able to manage it. Top right, so we live in a heavily regulated industry with some very robust standards, but there is an appetite in the industry to challenge those standards. So the There's some examples in relation to the approach that we've taken to dealing with legacy mining risk, where we've challenged the standards. We've worked with Network Rail to essentially avoid the need to grout up all of the legacy mine workings for 16 miles of the railway. We've only done grouting works where we've identified the highest areas of risk, and where we're creating the biggest and most significant infrastructure. So, but for example, Northumberland Park, before we started any works, we've had to plough £6 million worth of grout into the ground to basically shore up old mine workings that are beneath that station. Bottom left, so planning for the end of the start. I put in the bit that's in the green there, connect to active travel schemes. This came up actually in a meeting yesterday, where Stuart McNaughton from the local authority was describing what the local authority is doing around active travel schemes and cycling routes. And again, it just really emphasised the importance of the local authority leading the project and the benefits of that. But when I put these bullets in, I was thinking more about, as I touched on, when you get to the end of building all of these stations and upgrading the railway, you need to go through quite a lot of process to demonstrate, particularly to the Office of Road and Rail, that the stations and the railway are safe to operate, and that involves a lot of paperwork and evidence that you've basically collated throughout the life of the project. So having sort of systems and processes that plan for that and make it as efficient as possible is really important. Normal sort of industry timescales to open a station after construction is finished is about 26 weeks. We're down to about 12 weeks now on Northumberland, and every one that we're doing, we're learning. We've got a relationship with the Office of Road and Rail and other sort of authorising bodies. So that's got quicker and quicker and quicker every time. And then bottom right, integration is a sort of a broad word, and it means a lot in this context, but having integration of the team. So as I've touched on, the local authority, the operator in the sort of the core leadership team has been really important. Strong leadership of that team, being very clear on who's doing what and who's accountable for what, and keeping that team tight knit has been very beneficial. Lots of major programs have enormous management teams and layers of reporting and those sorts of things, and this is relatively a small scheme compared to the likes of High Speed 2 or Lower Thames Crossing or something like that. But I think what we've done is scalable, and it doesn't need to scale up quite to the sort of the same level as where information gets lost and reporting isn't as clear. So there's some sort of broad lessons. And the outcome of all of this, you know, there's the old phrase, if you build it, they will come. So yeah, we've exceeded 800,000 journeys. As I say, that's a bit higher than expectations, and it does create a bit of a challenge. In Ashington particularly, the regeneration of Ashington around Wansbeck Square and the old Wilko site, that's in full flight now. So already Wilko's, which was right next to the car park, has been demolished, and that area is being redeveloped. In more recent topical news, so in the top right, there's going to be a huge investment in data centres at this site at Camas, just the old power station at Blythe. So that will create an awful lot of jobs. It's not just because of the railway. In fact, it's not because of the railway, but the railway gives access to people in Blythe to get access to those jobs. And similarly, I think when Donald Trump was over, they announced some AI growth zones in the northeast. So this is around the business park at Cobalt, which is the business park next to Northumberland Park. So that has been designated as an AI growth zone. So really sort of high value investment. I think 5,000 new jobs, big businesses coming to the northeast, and the railway facilitating that growth. So that's the sort of big ticket sort of numbers. But Emily, who's online, has played a massive part in this element as well. So this is the sort of the social value that the project is bringing. And the numbers that are shown here are Morgan Sindall's numbers, and they're very, very impressive in terms of the scale of local spend. I was talking to Jerry earlier. So Morgan Sindall are essentially acting as a management contractor and then have a number of local subcontractors, many of whom have not worked on railway projects in the past. So through this project, Morgan Sindall have helped upskill those local businesses, and they can now position for and win work on railway projects that they wouldn't have been able to do before. Another thing to highlight, so there's some big numbers here, but in terms of impact as well, you can see the bottom left picture there. That is a digital virtual careers room that we've created that essentially gives people with special educational needs access to local jobs and sort of local training to get into work. So it's those sorts of things that are really sort of leaving a legacy for the region as well. So we've created a lot of disruption while we've been building the project, but we're leaving a really strong and positive legacy as well. So that's it. I'm not sure how we're doing for time. I've lost track a bit, but yeah, I was out for dinner on Friday night last week with my wife, and I sat next to a colleague and their wife, and she was in copywriting. She said, "What do you do in terms of your job?" I work on the railways. She said, "Do you enjoy it?" Oh, yeah, it's brilliant. And she said, "Can you summarise? Give me an elevator pitch of what excites you about working on the railways?" And I talked about this project. I said, for me personally, it's been a real privilege and really exciting to learn how these projects are sort of progressed and then sort of see them coming into fruition. But for the people of South East Northumberland, this is a project that is having a real impact, and you can talk about benefit cost ratios and the sort of monetary side of it, but every time I go up there, I can really sort of see the impact. And this is the picture of the day that the railway opened on the 14th of December last year, and you can just see the real genuine excitement from people in Ashington of finally getting their rail service back. So that's the end of my pitch. Thanks for listening. So
one question in the chat. So there are questions here.
Okay, I'll go to the chat. Oh,
I think it's further down.
Oh, sorry. You're right. Did you say there was a desire from the locals to reopen the line? Were they consulted on what they wanted? It's great to hear the ownership of the line now. Are all the stations designed to be accessible for all? What height of the platform we built? Mention of MVP makes my toes curl. Well, David Polhill, that's I think there's a few people who've worked on the project where yes, our toes have curled as well in relation to this concept of minimum viable product. So we won't linger on that. Our engineering manager, a chap called Alistair Bathy, I can see is online, so he'll be able to tell you what the height of the platforms are. The stations are all fully accessible, which is a key element of the sort of requirements of for the project, and that creates so actually one of the so you'll have seen Bebbside and Newsham, full lift stairs, so absolutely fully accessible. Ashington and Seaton, it's essentially sort of level with the car parks, so people can easily access the platforms there. Northumberland Park, lift and stairs, and then Bedlington, the access that we're creating at that southern end essentially allows people to easily access up a ramp onto the platforms at either end. And I can see Ali's put yes, he's put in the stats about the height of the platforms, 890 to 915 above the rail level. You can't see the chat, can you?
Did you have any environmental considerations when you were, for example, when you had to clear that foliage on the side of that?
We absolutely did. And I've missed one of David's questions as well, so I'll answer that, and I'll go back to David's question about the community engagement as well. Yeah, I mean, the project wasn't subject to an environmental impact assessment because of the way that we essentially manage the early stages, but we adopted the principles of an environmental impact assessment, and the key element of the scope is essentially biodiversity net gain. So everywhere where we've had to take vegetation out, we've more than compensated for it elsewhere. And then we've come across the usual ecological challenges of newt, particularly at Seaton, which slowed us up, and made sure that they're suitably managed. And I'll just pick up on the question about engagement with communities, because it is a very good question. So as part of the early stages of the development and thinking about particularly where the stations would be sited, Ali and colleagues were very much involved in public consultations and making sure that the voice of local communities was heard, to the point that there was some local residents who were directly impacted, and some people who have lost their houses, and members of the team actually in very early stages would sit in their houses and they'd explain the project and have a cup of tea. And it's been really positive actually that where people have been seriously impacted, they've understood the sort of the greater benefits. So yeah, it's been very well supported locally.
Were they relocated?
Yes, they were compensated and relocated as part of the project.
Compensated to find their own relief.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? So this is a very good question. So I didn't touch on this, but so sorry. The question was about what's the impact on housing being adjacent to the stations? So if you were to go up to Northumberland today, you would see a lot of house building up and down the line. That's not directly related to the railway, but a key aspect of the project that I haven't touched on, but I think it's worth picking up on, is that the local authority has adopted a process called land value capture. So before the project was fully funded and given its planning permission, the local authority basically set up contribution agreements with the local landowners that essentially, when the value of the land and properties go up, a proportion of that is given back to the council. And it's basically a virtuous arrangement because everyone gets the benefit and it helps get some funding into the project to make it happen in the first place. But property prices and house building around these locations is all part of the stimulus that the railway creates. It is, and I'm thinking about other projects that I'm looking at now. So there's another project in the northeast called the Leamside Line, where part of the early feasibility work that we're doing is looking at local plans and thinking about future housing. And there's nationally there's going to be these sort of new towns, and there's things like that linking to infrastructure and stations is really important to feed all of that in. Another question in the room.
Movement of pallets by rail. What is the history of that, and and what about the future? Is that for a considerable period of time?
Yeah, so the question's about wood burning pellets at Linemouth Power Station. So I assume it was a coal-fired power station originally. I'm getting a nod from the room, and then it's converted to wooden pellets that no doubt come from Canada or somewhere like that. And I think they do come into Blythe. Yes. But I don't know in terms of the sort of the UK's long-term energy green transition, what the long-term plan is for Linemouth. There's another. I'm grinning because there's another freight train that operates on the railway as well, which is the alumina train that takes alumina up to Fort William, which is a bit odd because it comes round on a boat round the north of Scotland and then into Blythe and then back up to Scotland on the train. But anyway.
The cost savings that were described, they sort of equate to delivering less during the project. Were they significant savings in the scale of the project, and were they worthwhile in your opinion?
Yeah, so the questions about where we've reduced or saved costs. So there's different levels of cost savings. So one example would be at Bedlington Station, where, going back to the accessibility question, that station could well have had a lift ramp and stairs as well, but through a risk assessment process and through agreement with Northern as the operator and all of the sort of the safety boards, one of the processes we went through was to demonstrate that you could safely access the railway on both sides using the level crossing. So that's one example where probably £5 to £10 million has been saved. Another one is up towards Ashington, the equivalent of Palmersville Dairy, that underpass, there was a need for, or there's a foot crossing like that could have been replaced by a similar underpass. But there we took a different approach and we went through planning arrangements and public consultation to get that crossing closed and got support for that. So again, that saved an awful lot of money in removing the need for an underpass. But there's different things at various levels in terms of savings. The biggest cost that would have killed the project would have been if we'd have had to grout up all of the legacy mine works for the entire route. Just doing the ground investigations for that alone would have taken probably 2 or 3 years and cost tens of millions of pounds, let alone the cost of grouting, and therefore delaying the project, which means that everything costs more.
As a derogation, what was that for a network rail to number it up?
So the question is about how much of a derogation was it in terms of the sort of the not having to do all of the legacy mining. So there's a risk assessment process that you follow, and some of it is actually I might be wrong with what I'm saying here, but some of it seems to be down to almost the subjective opinion of people within a certain community within Network Rail that needed persuading of the fact that what we were doing was safe, and that, you know, essentially there wasn't going to be a legacy asset issue. So there was a tension there between Network Rail, the mining engineer, Network Rail HQ, and the geotechnical engineer in the route. And the geotechnical engineer was willing to accept the risk on the basis that we'd done loads of ground investigation, and actually 5 miles to the west of this railway you've got the East Coast Main Line that is running over exactly the same mine workings and isn't subject to the same sort of level of investigation and those sort of things. So there was a really sort of strong argument and logical argument there to sort of work that through. There's someone online who's got a question, so do we need to unmute?
Oh, can do, if somebody wants to be unmuted.
Can I do that?
I don't think you can. Is it?
Just bear with us, Andrew. Howard's just going to, you might want to unmute everybody, and then there's other questions.
Simon, you've got a couple of other questions in the chat as well.
Go on then, Emily, read them out.
So one is about evidence of modal shift since the trains started running. And the other one is around digital twin concept in terms of structural monitoring to help future projects and maintenance regime not considered.
Okay, right. Howard, unmute Ali for the second question. He's my technical phone a friend. In terms of the modal shift and understanding the impact of the railway on the local transport network, and actually what the demand and, you know, the passenger numbers will ultimately be, we're now just about to start work on what they call benefits realization. So essentially, when the project is complete, you then go through a process of monitoring and evaluation to make sure that what is being delivered is in line with what the plan was in the business case at the start. And the local authority has sort of started that work this year, but you can't really do it fully until all of the stations are open, and you don't really know the answer until you've actually been running and operating the railway for at least 2 years. So I suspect all the indications are that, you know, that the patronage is better. Hopefully there will be, part of the business case was absolutely about decongestion and the environmental benefits of taking cars off the road, but we haven't actually seen the full figures from that yet. Ali, I don't know if you can unmute if you want to talk about the digital twin. Don't know if you can unmute him, Howard.
Oh, I
But
can, yeah.
oh, there you go.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah, loud and clear.
I was just typing away in the background there. I'm not entirely sure with regards to the digital twin in terms of how that interfaces with the future projects and maintenance. But what we did do in the early days was we trialed Bentley iTwin in terms of during the design process in order to create effectively a digital twin of the designs. Unfortunately, with the accelerated program that you mentioned throughout sort of the post-COVID days following pace and just the political desire to try and open this railway sooner, we sort of abandoned the Bentley iTwin. But in essence, as part of the handback, the health and safety file and handback entry into service or post-entry into service process, we do deliver all the as-builts to Network Rail and the council and any other asset owners. And a lot of the as-builts can also be accompanied by the 3D models that were used in order to design them. So whilst not a perfect digital twin, there is fairly reasonable sort of digital as-built information provided to the asset owners.
The other thing, Ali, to answer Aid's question, is so in terms of digital monitoring, it is the line will be monitored using the plane line pattern recognition train and all that. So there is an operations and maintenance strategy specifically for the railway that was considered. Okay. Andrew, do you want to ask your question? I think he's unmuted. Muted. And you're muted now. There you go. You're unmuted now, Andrew. If you want to put your question in the chat, Andrew, then we can probably pick that up. Of course, yeah.
Some of your pictures show a single track line, but I think if I understood correctly, the whole line is double track now.
No,
Oh,
no. So the southern end was essentially single track, and then when you get to Newsham, the railway was essentially twin track. But we have only extended the twin track section 1 kilometre south, and then there was the bit I said there was Seg Hill Loop. So essentially that loop is there so that the freight trains can essentially sort of slowly trundle along on that loop while the passenger trains go up and down. So, but again linked to this minimum viable product, that's essentially it gives good operational performance. In fact, the reliability on the railway has been very high, which is good.
and the cars that are owned are not owned, they're leased, I think they said.
Yes, yeah. So I don't understand quite how rolling stock leasing works in the UK. It seems incredibly complex. Yeah.
But they're owned by the Northern Line that operates.
So Northern operator, it's the biggest operator in the UK that operates from Carlisle down to Sheffield across to Hull, and yeah, this is Northern Trains as the operator. Yeah. Andrew, do you want to try again? Yeah. So a lot of this again goes, the level crossing closures goes through a consultation process. So in every case, there are ways around the railway through a crossing that's further away. I think there's one example of a crossing. In fact, well, here's a topical one. So there's a crossing called Chase Meadows that we haven't reached our conclusion on that yet in terms of what's going to happen with it. So essentially, it's similar to the one that you saw. It's a foot crossing that's used by 2 or 3 dog walkers a day. But to replace that level crossing, the cost of installing a bridge over the railway that would not be fully accessible, just a stepped bridge, would be, I think, in the region of £7 or £8 million. Well, I don't know the specifics of each one. Yeah. Yes. So I mean the one that I talked about, Hospital Crossing in Ashington, about 200 meters around. There's a way for them to get around the railway and around the town anyway. But yeah, they have further to walk.
And the other thing is the interest rate got to expand.
Mhm.
When to put in expanding some secure sign parking.
Yes. Yeah, well, all of the stations have got secure cycle parking at them. Yeah. Probably couldn't see it on the photos. If I can't go back now, but yeah, that is provided. So at Ashington, it's quite a big facility. Yeah. Right. Well, it's not. Yeah, yeah. So I reckon. So I get the train from Newark, and I recognise secure parking there. That it is essentially a box, and yeah, that this is essentially racking in a shelter. Yeah. No, I wouldn't go. I think you have to basically chain your bike to the racking. Yeah, it's open. Mm. Absolutely. So sorry if I've not been clear. So I'm getting quite a lot of questions about cycling accessibility to the stations, and that bridge you saw over the A189 is specifically so people can cycle to the station at Bebbside. So, so they are pretty secure, and they're covered by CCTV. Yeah. Okay, so I'll just read it. So Ali said, so regarding the question about twin tracks, the track configuration and the location of the loops was directly informed by the early timetabling works that showed where the trains would pass. So the minimum viable product was no extra track designed unless it was absolutely necessary. And I think Ali's emphasising there what I'm saying, that we're in a world of constrained budgets, so we've tried to find that sweet spot of just doing enough, but it's come to fruition, and it's successful because the reliability of the passenger service and the freight still operating is very high.
Extending that question a bit more, apart from the 1 kilometre extension in the twin track, was it always a single track then a twin track before?
I think in the 60s it was twin track throughout, but the embankments particularly have really deteriorated. I mean, the one that I showed you, it was a full of rabbit holes. They've moved the track into the middle to avoid where the sort of side of the embankment's falling away. Lost my thing again. There we go. Will there be a full breakdown of the project costs made available so we can see where the money has gone into the project? E.g., how much for Ashington Station, cost of Bedlington sidings, the cost of the track works and the signalling, etc. That is a perfectly fair and sort of topical question. So, and I have quite a few of the numbers etched on the sort of the back of my mind, but I think the full project costs will be available. I'm sure through a FOI request, they will be available. We still haven't completed the project, so I expect that the local authority and the DFT would be resistant to me announcing numbers in front of people today. I know when I did a presentation like this in February down at the Institution of Civil Engineers, I was asked to remove a slide that had costs in. But yeah, we've got absolutely a full breakdown for each station, for all the rail corridor. And yeah, it's important that they're made available, because this is part of benchmarking other projects of a similar scale. And from what I've seen of some of those other projects that I mentioned earlier, I think that they may have similar challenges to Northumberland in terms of they've got an ambitious cost envelope at the moment, and we've got real lived experience of how much it costs to deliver some of this.
Still time.
Yeah.
To join
So, Aid Richards, what are the lessons learnt about a change to accelerated programme for Northumberland Line? Was it a worthwhile decision in the end? So Aid's basically saying, yeah, would we do it like this again? And I think, given the circumstance of COVID, project speed, the timing being right, I think we've navigated the different hurdles that we've had to get over effectively. I wouldn't sort of advise any project to sort of start with a budget that's not achievable to deliver for, or a program that's too ambitious. So you should be realistic. But in this case, I'll be honest with you, there was a point when we submitted the outline business case at the end of 2021 where we were told by we were basically told, if it's not this number, you will not get the funding for the project. And we were thinking, well, it's going to cost more than that. And I said, no, it has to be that number or you won't get the funding. So that drove the need for it to be that number. And then this concept of what needs to be true to achieve that. Now, since then, we've had to navigate the explanation of why it's cost more and all those sort of things. But in that point, you know, do we regret the fact that we got the funding and it moved forward? Probably not. But was it the right thing? Probably not as well.
Are you saying you have to increase the estimate in order to get funding?
Yeah, so at the time of normally you get to full business case and you've got a contractor on board who has essentially priced up the project. But in this case, we were at full business case and we were still closing out the ground investigation. We hadn't even completed the design. So it was our best estimate at that point in time.
So you could use an estimate.
Exactly. And it was a number without a range around it. And this is what I was saying, where if you need to learn from this and apply a sensible range. Okay.
Okay. Let's draw things to a close. Thank you everyone for your questions. Thank you for joining, those online and those in the room here in Rugby. So if we may just once again show our appreciation to Simon for his presentation. And just for those people here in the room, there are a few bits of paper on the table over there showing some other events that are going on in this area. So thank you once again for joining and have a good evening.
Thanks, Howard. Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Ali.
See you later, Howard. Bye.